On February 14, 1943, the German 10th Panzer Division tore through Kasserine Pass like a scalpel through wet paper, leaving 6,500 American casualties and 3,000 prisoners in a 6-day wake of wreckage. To Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Americans weren't just defeated, they were amateurs, a mongrel nation of immigrants whose army ranked 19th in the world, smaller than the forces of Portugal or Romania. But Rommel was observing a systemic software bug, not a permanent state of failure. While Nazi ideology dismissed the U.S. as a decadent industrial state, the integrated machine was actually a 9,900-pound technical gamble that traded individual agility for massive systemic durability. This machine was initially broken. At the peak of the breakthrough, 30% of the transport fleet was deadlined daily, and then the average lifespan of a logistics vehicle plummeted from 30,000 miles to just 10,000. It was a system where leadership stayed 70 miles behind a 30-mile wide failure point, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, a 7-ton flying milk bottle, cost 18 pilots their lives in training before ever seeing a German target. The unpredictable enemy didn't win through tactical perfection or the professionalism the Germans respected in the British. They won through an industrial triage that treated the destruction of 5,000 trucks and a 26% bomber loss rate as acceptable overhead. This is the forensic story of how a broken bureaucratic giant cannibalized its own failures to create an arithmetic of victory that no amount of German tactical mastery could stop. Before we dive into the systemic wreckage of Kasserine, what is the most unsustainable technical failure you've heard of from World War II? Drop the statistics and the hard data in the comments. If you want more history stripped of its miracles and returned to its mechanics, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The American entry into the ground war in North Africa did not begin with a surge of industrial power, but with a systemic fracture across a 30-mile front. By February 1943, the U.S. Second Corps had deployed into the Tunisian desert following a pre-war doctrine that prioritized the dispersal of forces, a fatal software bug that left individual units isolated and incapable of mutual support. At the center of this collapse was Major General Lloyd Fredendall, whose command style was defined by a profound bureaucratic detachment. While his soldiers occupied exposed forward positions, Fredendall directed the battle from an elaborate underground command post carved into a mountainside 70 miles behind the front lines. The stiff price for this operational distance was paid in the complete breakdown of tactical communication. Engineers who should have been laying minefields or hardening defensive positions were instead diverted to excavating the general's bunker. On February 14th, the friction of the machine became a total seizure. As the 10th Panzer Division struck, the American system was incapable of processing the speed of the German maneuver. Artillery batteries were overrun before they could fire effective salvos, and infantry units broke under the accurate fire of German 88mm guns. The mechanical attrition was staggering. Millions of dollars in tanks and equipment were abandoned in the sand as units fled in a disorganized route. In just 6 days of chaotic retreat, the American machine suffered 6,500 casualties, including 3,000 men marched into captivity. This was not a failure of individual courage, but a failure of a 19th-ranked army trying to operate a complex modern system without the necessary processing power of experience. The internal data of the U.S. Army at this stage revealed a fragile organization struggling with the high cost of entry into industrial war. Many replacements arrived at the front with 0 hours of completed basic training, thrust into a system where leadership had failed at every level. The P-47 Thunderbolt, intended to provide the air cover pillar of this integrated machine, was a 9,900-pound monster that was 65% heavier than its predecessors. In its initial deployment phase, the systemic friction was so high that training accidents alone claimed 41 aircraft and 18 pilots before the unit ever engaged the enemy. This was the fault line, a moment where the American military was a collection of automobiles and washing machine factories trying to function as a weapon of war, only to find that its initial output was nothing more than high-quality scrap metal. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, watching the retreat, concluded that the Americans were mere amateurs who would require years to reach professional maturity. He failed to realize he was looking at a learning organization that was already beginning to treat this disaster as a massive data set for recalibration. The German intelligence apparatus that surveyed the American military potential in 1939 did not see a future superpower. It saw a systemic anomaly destined for collapse under the pressures of industrial war. At the core of this assessment was a profound bureaucratic friction between Nazi ideological dogma and the logistical reality of the United States. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world in total size, maintaining a force smaller than the standing armies of Portugal or Romania. To the German High Command, this lack of scale was a data point confirming their central thesis. America was a mongrel nation, a fragmented collection of immigrants from every corner of the globe who lacked the cultural homogeneity and Aryan bloodline required for inherent martial superiority. Adolf Hitler's inner circle dismissed the U.S. as a state incapable of holding together under the terrible pressure of modern conflict, viewing its diverse population as a fundamental weakness rather than a resource. This racial science served as a filter through which all American technical data was processed. While American factories were mass-producing 3.7 million automobiles a year in the late 1930s, German analysts noted they were not producing a single modern tank or heavy artillery piece. The bureaucratic assumption in Berlin was that a society divided by class, ethnicity, and political disagreement would be unable to pivot its industrial base toward a singular military purpose. Even the memory of the First World War reinforced this prejudice. Non-German veterans remembered the 1917 doughboys as enthusiastic but tactically naive amateurs who were unable to sustain complex operations. The Nazi leadership essentially bet the war on the belief that American diversity would create too much internal friction to ever achieve institutional cohesion. However, this ideological assessment ignored the mechanical attrition of a system that was actually a learning organization in a state of rapid, forced maturity. The stiff price of this transformation was an initial failure rate that the Germans misinterpreted as permanent incompetence. For example, the early American logistical machine had to contend with the reality that its standardized 2.5-ton trucks were being worn out 3 times faster than their peacetime expectations, and with tires destroyed by the thousands on the primitive road networks of the early campaign. While German propaganda focused on American softness, the American system was already beginning to prioritize volume and speed over traditional, professional military patterns, a pivot that German models, rooted in the concept of a singular, pure fighting spirit, simply could not calculate. The German failure to recognize the American capacity for decentralized adaptation would become the ultimate bureaucratic fault line. By the time field-level realists like Erwin Rommel realized that American generals were becoming very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, the industrial avalanche was already irreversible. The systemic failure at Kasserine Pass triggered an immediate institutional triage, beginning with the removal of Major General Fredendall and the insertion of George S. Patton to command the Second Corps. This was not a change in personnel so much as a recalibration of the organization's operating system. Patton's arrival acted as a tornado of energy, imposing a rigid disciplinary framework to counteract the lethargy and poor coordination that had led to the 30-mile collapse. The transformation was achieved in a compressed window of just 4 weeks. The time elapsed between the conclusion of the Kasserine debacle and the engagement at El Guitar. During this interval, the American machine focused on standardization and the enforcement of extreme accountability. Officers who failed to maintain uniform standards or showed cowardice under fire were threatened with court-martial, while soldiers were forced into a regime of continuous training to bridge the gap between amateur status and professional combat effectiveness. The stiff price for this rapid evolution was an intense mechanical and human attrition. Success was not a result of a sudden surge in bravery, but of a gritty, unapproved fix to the Army's internal friction. The systemic response manifested at El Guitar on March 23, 1943. Where the 10th Panzer Division expected a repeat of their February victory. Instead, they encountered a stabilized defensive system. American infantry held their ground with a cohesion that had been absent 28 days prior, while tank destroyers and minefields were integrated into killing zones that disabled the lead German panzers. At the most significant technical pivot was the introduction of a centralized artillery system that could mass fire with unprecedented efficiency. What the 10th Panzer encountered was a prototype of the integrated machine, a systematic coordination that erased the distance between forward observers and battery positions. Instead of independent batteries firing scattered salvos, the Americans utilized a concentrated storm of steel adjusted with speed and accuracy that German artillerists found incomprehensible. By the end of the engagement, 30 German tanks were left burning or disabled, and hundreds of prisoners were taken. The German survivors reported that this was the first instance in the conflict where they had been stopped by mere artillery and infantry without significant armored support. This was the triage in action. An organization that had been routed in February was now conducting offensive operations with a skill that rivaled veteran Axis formations. The speed of this improvement defied every German model for estimating enemy capabilities, as the Americans successfully treated their own disastrous performance at Kasserine as a data set for rapid adaptation. The pivot of the American system from the chaos of Kasserine to the dominance of the Western Front was anchored in a bureaucratic and mathematical revolution, the Fire Direction Center, FDC. Developed during the interwar years at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the FDC was a systemic solution to the problem of traditional artillery friction. While German and British systems relied on forward observers communicating directly with their own specific batteries, and creating a fragmented and slow response, the American FDC centralized fire control at the battalion level. This allowed any observer on the battlefield to call for fire from any battery within range, regardless of prior unit affiliation. The technical results were devastatingly asymmetrical. Standardized procedures and mechanical calculators reduced the interval from a fire request to shells on target to approximately 3 minutes. By comparison, the more rigid German fire control system required 10 to 12 minutes to achieve the same result, a systemic lag that often allowed American units to maneuver out of danger while German troops remained pinned under an escalating storm of steel. This mechanical advantage was augmented by the introduction of the proximity fuse in December 1944, a technical gamble that cost the American industrial machine over $1 billion to develop, a sum second only to the Manhattan Project. The fuse utilized a miniature radar set capable of detecting the ground and triggering a detonation at an optimal height of 30 feet, showering shrapnel downward into foxholes and trenches. This systemic upgrade was 5 to 10 times more lethal than conventional impact-fused artillery, which often buried its lethal energy in soft ground before detonating. General George Patton described the effect of this funny fuse with clinical satisfaction, noting instances where a single battalion concentration killed 72 German soldiers by actual count. The industrial output required to sustain this system defied the comprehension of German logisticians. A single American battery, C of the 337th Field Artillery Battalion, fired its 300,000th round within a 9-month window. During the Rhine crossing in March 1945, the system reached peak density, with 2,070 guns delivering over 1,000 rounds per minute, totaling 65,000 shells in a single hour of bombardment. The stiff price for this firepower was a logistical nightmare. The U.S. had to standardize every shell manufactured in Ohio to fit a gun assembled in Michigan, served by a crew trained in Oklahoma. Meanwhile, the German system was collapsing under the weight of mechanical attrition, forced to use a mix of captured French, Polish, and Soviet guns, each requiring unique parts and calibers that could not be cross-leveled. The Americans didn't just have better guns, they had a better algorithm for delivering destruction. If you were a German commander in 1944, what would terrify you more? An American tank you can see, or a fragile Piper Cub circling overhead that you can't hit, knowing it has the power to call down a 3-minute storm of steel? Let us know your tactical reasoning in the comments. The systemic evolution of the American machine faced its most severe physical friction in the bocage of Normandy. A nightmare of ancient hedgerows, where earthen banks, some reaching 15 feet in height and topped with centuries of dense vegetation, turned every individual field into a natural fortress. Here, the standard doctrine of mobile armored warfare seized. Sherman tanks, forced to climb over these banks, exposed their thin belly armor to German anti-tank fire, while infantry squads were systematically pinned down by machine guns with interlocking fields of fire. The stiff price of this tactical stalemate was measured in yards rather than miles, as the offensive ground to a halt throughout June and early July 1944. The German High Command, observing this paralysis, assumed the Americans were incapable of solving a problem that required improvisation rather than simple material volume. What the German analysts failed to account for was the American capacity for grassroots systemic triage. Instead of waiting for a bureaucratic solution from higher headquarters, units began independently developing mechanical fixes. The most critical adaptation came from Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division, who utilized scrap steel salvaged from the very Czech hedgehog beach obstacles Erwin Rommel had ordered, placed to stop the invasion. By welding these steel teeth onto the hulls of Sherman tanks, Cullen created a device capable of tearing through the earthen banks at ground level, allowing armor to burst through the foliage rather than exposing their vulnerable undersides. The institutional response was remarkably lateral. Once General Omar Bradley witnessed a demonstration, he bypassed traditional procurement channels and ordered immediate mass production. Ordnance units worked around the clock, utilizing salvaged German steel to fabricate these hedgerow cutters. The data reflects a staggering rate of institutional adaptation. Within just 3 weeks, 60% of all tanks in the First Army, roughly 3 out of every 5 vehicles, were equipped with the improvised device. This solution was kept a strict military secret to maximize the technical shock of the upcoming breakout. This was not a miracle of design, but a triage of necessity that utilized scavenged enemy material to overcome a 15-foot physical barrier that pre-war doctrine had entirely ignored. The Americans weren't just fighting with what they brought. They were cannibalizing the battlefield to repair their own failing systems in real time. By late July 1944, the American machine resolved the friction of the bocage by transitioning from grassroots improvisation to a massive industrial avalanche known as Operation Cobra. This was a battle of annihilation designed to shatter the German defensive crust through the application of overwhelming vertical pressure. The systemic protagonist was no longer the individual tank or infantry squad, but a coordinated strike of 1,500 heavy bombers delivering high explosives and fragmentation loads into a precisely defined geometric rectangle. This target area, measuring approximately 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles deep, became the proving ground for a new level of American combined arms power. The stiff price of this operation was the total abandonment of surgical precision for the logic of mass saturation. The primary data point for this technical success was the erasure of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite armored formations in the German military. Positioned directly in the center of the impact zone, Panzer Lehr was subjected to a level of destruction that defies traditional tactical models. In a single afternoon, the division's operational capacity plummeted. A unit that had entered the engagement with 45 functional armored vehicles was reduced to just 7 tanks capable of independent movement. Human attrition was equally catastrophic, with over 1,000 German soldiers killed within the first few hours of the bombardment. The systemic response from the German side was a total collapse of command and control, As survivors emerged from the dust, too dazed to organize a coherent defense. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein reported that no campaign in history could match the magnitude of this seamless collaboration between sea, air, and ground forces. The aftermath of Cobra demonstrated the industrial speed of the American recovery system. While the German 7th Army was systematically dismantled in the Falaise Pocket, leading to the surrender of 50,000 men, the American logistics chain maintained a pace of 35 miles per hour to keep the flowing river of material moving forward. The mechanical attrition was accepted as a necessary overhead. When tanks were destroyed in the breakthrough, new replacements arrived within days from depots that never seemed to empty. This industrial cycle ensured that even as American units wore out 5,000 trucks and 23,000 men during the push across France, the system never stalled. For German commanders like Heinz Guderian, the realization was clinical. They were not losing to better soldiers, but to an integrated machine that could replace its losses faster than the German military could count them. The systemic divergence between Allied forces created a dual-front friction for the German High Command, where predictability was traded for an escalating, chaotic speed. And German intelligence consistently classified British operations as professional and methodical, rooted in recognizable patterns developed during the North African desert campaigns. This methodical approach allowed German planners to anticipate Montgomery's set-piece attacks days in advance, as they were preceded by massive logistical buildups and hours of preliminary bombardment. In Normandy, this predictability resulted in a strategic bottleneck. German command committed 6 of their 7 available panzer divisions to the British sector around Caen. This concentration was a rational response to a known quantity, a tactical triage where the Germans used their most elite formations, including the 12th SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr, to anchor the front against an enemy that telegraphed every major shift in momentum. The American sector, by contrast, functioned as a learning organization that prioritized speed and volume over doctrinal traditionalism. Where the British provided advance warning, the Americans attacked with a systemic aggression that bypassed traditional hierarchical approval. German field realists, like General Blumentritt, noted that Patton's operations even improved on the Napoleonic tenet of speed and more speed, creating a level of lightning-like action that the German defensive models simply could not simulate. This aggression came at a stiff price of mechanical attrition. During the breakout from the bocage, the American machine accepted a 30% deadline rate for its transport fleet, essentially burning through 5,000 trucks and thousands of replacement engines to sustain a 35-mile-per-hour logistical river. While the British husbanded their manpower due to a 24-month longer combat exposure, the American system treated 65,000 shells fired in a single hour as an acceptable operational cost to maintain the unpredictable tempo that shattered German morale. The systemic scandal was that the German High Command had misread American chaos as amateurism. By late 1944, they realized the Americans were not fighting in isolated units, but as an integrated machine of sea, air, and ground forces that achieved seamless collaboration. This machine was supported by an industrial tail that replaced destroyed Shermans within days from depots that never emptied. Field Marshal von Rundstedt admitted in post-war debriefings that he was never certain what the Americans would do until they were already doing it, whereas he could map the British advance through simple aerial reconnaissance of their logistical buildup. The American system had mastered a form of industrial blitzkrieg that replaced veteran tactical skill with sheer, relentless arithmetic. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 served as the final systemic audit for an American military that had spent 22 months evolving from the fragmented failure of Kasserine Pass into a mature, learning organization. When the German Ardennes offensive struck with complete tactical surprise, it sought to exploit the same softness Hitler had identified in 1939, a belief that American soldiers would crumble under the shock of veteran panzer formations. However, the institutional response was no longer a disorganized rout, but a series of localized triages that bought time for the larger machine to pivot. At Lanzerath Ridge, a single intelligence platoon and 4 artillery observers, 22 men in total, utilized the systemic advantage of pre-sighted fire to hold off 500 elite German paratroopers for 18 hours. This was the stiff price of the delay, a sacrifice of small units to ensure the industrial-scale response could mobilize. The mechanical attrition of the Ardennes defense was staggering. As German spearheads like Kampfgruppe Piper stalled, American engineers systematically destroyed every bridge and set fire to fuel depots, denying the enemy the very resources the American logistics chain provided in abundance. The pivot of Patton's Third Army, moving 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles 90 degrees northward through winter conditions in just 3 days, represented a logistical feat that defied German models of maneuver. By the time the system reached the Rhine in March 1945, the arithmetic of victory had become an industrial avalanche. During the Ninth Army's crossing, 2,070 American guns opened fire at a sustained rate exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute, delivering 65,000 shells in a single hour. This output would have exhausted the entire ammunition stocks of a German corps, yet for the American machine, it was merely the standard operational overhead for a river crossing. The final tally reveals a system that succeeded by treating massive loss as acceptable overhead. To maintain the momentum that broke the Wehrmacht, the U.S. wore out 5,000 trucks and 23,000 men on the Red Ball Express alone. The German commanders who survived the war struggled to explain this transformation. They had measured American potential by their worst moment in Tunisia and failed to account for an organization that treated failure as a data set for improvement. By the spring of 1945, the mongrel nation had built an integrated machine for waging modern industrial war that no individual tactical skill could stop. The Americans did not win because they were supermen. They won because they built a system that multiplied individual effectiveness through the sheer, relentless weight of standardized math and bottomless logistics. We focus on the legends, but the data shows it was the mechanics and the math that broke the Wehrmacht. If you want more history stripped of its miracles and returned to its mechanics, subscribe and join our community of forensic historians. Which part of the American integrated machine surprised you the most? Let's discuss the data in the comments.